It seemed like a crazy decision. When Ukraine's forces fell back north of Pokrovsk, many thought they were giving up the key Donetsk city. They weren't. Ukraine's forces made a strategic sacrifice to break Russia's southern army. Pokrovsk was placed on the altar of war so that Ukraine could prepare for something much bigger elsewhere, and the gamble has paid off. Total victory over Russia in Zaporizhzhia has arrived. Now, at first glance, what's happening in the Donetsk region of Ukraine seems like a nightmare scenario. Pokrovsk and the surrounding settlements are officially lost. That's according to the AMK Mapping X account, which says that Russia's reclamation of Radinska has placed the entire Pokrovsk agglomeration under Russia's control. That settlement, along with Pokrovsk, Mirnorad, Novohradivka and Hradivka, are now in Russian hands after a battle that lasted over 1.5 years. The fall of Pokrovsk came in the wake of Russia's scaling up of offensives to the north of the city in an effort to surround it, the Kyiv Independent reported on February the 16th. That scaling up left Ukraine's 7th Corps as one of the very few units still holding positions in the Pokrovsk agglomeration, and the Russian forces were closing in fast. The order to withdraw came soon after this report, leading to Pokrovsk's capture, a shocking half a year after Putin made that capture the key goal of Russia's 2025 summer offensive. This is a city that was meant to fall when the sun still shone, allowing Russia to consolidate its position ahead of a deeper push into Donetsk during the winter. That push never happened because Pokrovsk held on for far longer than it had any right to. This should be a time for Putin's forces to celebrate, but it isn't. Looks can be deceiving, and the pincer movement that Russia was trying to create around Pokrovsk just a couple of days ago was something that Ukraine expected. And when Ukraine withdrew from the Pokrovsk sector, it did so knowing that it was doing something very important, making a small sacrifice in Donetsk so it could make massive gains elsewhere. And here's the twist to the Pokrovsk tale. As David Axe explains in a February 18th column for Euromaidan Press, the gains the Russians have made in recent days in and around the neighbouring cities of Pokrovsk and Mirnorad, 100 kilometres northeast of Huliapola, merely consolidate Russian control over those cities and don't really help the Russians advance toward their ultimate objectives in Donetsk Oblast, the twin cities of Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, 50 kilometers to the northeast, Axe explains. In other words, all that Russia has managed to achieve in Pokrovsk is taking a city that Ukraine was only holding so long to inflict as much damage on Russia's forces in Donetsk. Tens of thousands of Russian soldiers died taking a city that they were already most of the way to holding. And now, as you'll discover if you keep watching the video, they have an even bigger challenge ahead of them as they try to push deeper into Donetsk. What we've seen here is Ukraine purposefully sacrificing the Pokrovsk sector. It seems like a strange choice. With Pokrovsk having long been considered one of the most important logistical nodes in Donetsk, it may even seem like an insane decision to allow the city to fall. However, Ukraine had a master plan when it pulled its forces out of Pokrovsk. Let Russia have its Pyrrhic victory because Ukraine had much bigger fish to fry elsewhere. Ukraine sacrificed Pokrovsk so it could ruin Russia's southern army in Zaporizhzhia. The reality for Russia is that its gains in Pokrovsk are gains that it should have made months ago. They've moved practically nowhere, and Pokrovsk is no longer seen as the logistical node that would help Ukraine push back in Donetsk. The city was turned into a death trap, and Putin's forces paid a massive price in blood to get it. And as that price was being paid, Ukraine turned its attention to something much more valuable in the southeast of the country. An enormous Ukrainian counterattack was launched in the southeast as Russia took control over the Pokrovsk region, leading to Ukraine making massive gains that delivered something much more valuable than the city that it had just lost. How? Well, as Axe explains, Ukraine's focus on Pokrovsk toward the end of 2025 turned its attention away from the Zaporizhzhia region. The path for Russia into that region was left relatively open, Axe says, as it was devoid of any major fortifications. However, every path that Russia can take toward Kramatorsk and Sloviansk is extremely well fortified. Ukraine knows that those paths are going to churn through tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Russian troops. But the pathway to Zaporizhzhia being so open would have allowed Russia to advance quickly in that region as soon as Putin placed his focus on it. So, Ukraine pulled the Pokrovsk plug to make gains in Zaporizhzhia, with those gains being part of a larger campaign to fortify heavily ahead of a future Russian assault. And that's one of the reasons why Ukraine made its sacrifice, along with several others that we'll be digging into soon. But before we do, Axe explains what we have seen on the Zaporizhzhia front in recent weeks. Ukraine's heaviest counterattacks came in the southeast direction, across a 35-kilometer or 21.7-mile sector that stretched from Pokrovsk, which is a settlement in Dnipropetrovsk that is easy to confuse with Pokrovsk in Donetsk, and the city of Huliopole in the south. That region was under attack by Russia's Dnipro group of forces, who ACT says held a 5-to-1 manpower advantage. Rather than trying to take advantage of that extra manpower with massive assaults, Russia has been sending infiltration units into the southeastern sector to inch closer toward claiming Zaporizhzhia city. Ukraine sacrificed Pokrovsk so that it could respond to this push. A massive Ukrainian counterattack, which saw Ukraine rush its forces south toward the Huliopole sector, began in early February. Airborne and assault brigades combined forces to attack from the west and north of the Russian positions in the sector, placing pressure on Russia's 36th Combined Arms Army in Pokrovsk. Russia's southern army was caught entirely by surprise, and the collapse of Russian positions quickly followed. Ukraine deployed its 425th Assault Regiment, which has been fighting actively north of Pokrovsk until February, to take part in the counterattack. This is just one example of Ukraine's sacrifice. Ukraine knew that moving this regiment would enable Russia to advance in Pokrovsk. The trade-off was that the regiment played a starring role in the assaults to the southeast that have allowed Ukraine to liberate massive amounts of territory that Russia thought it could hold. And when we say massive amounts, we mean it. But before we go deeper into that, this is why we make the military show, to explain what battlefield changes really mean. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Now, Ukraine's Pokrovsk gamble has paid off massively, with a helping hand from a major blow to the gut that Russia experienced, which we'll expose in just a couple of minutes. According to France 24, Ukraine's southeast counterattack led to it making the fastest battlefield gains that it has enjoyed in 2.5 years. Those with long memories will realize that the last time Ukraine made such extensive gains was during the country's massive summer 2023 counteroffensive. And up until February 16th, Ukraine had retaken 201 square kilometers, or 78 square miles, of occupied territory in the southeast, which roughly amounts to all of the territory that Russia has managed to gain during its December push towards Zaporizhzhia. Much of the recaptured territory is concentrated in a sector about 80 kilometers, or almost 50 miles, to the east of Zaporizhzhia city, which is the entire point. What were once grey zones into which Russia was infiltrating is now fully territory that is fully under Ukraine's control. And with that control, Ukraine is going to close a gap that has existed for far too long, which will be hell for Russia as it tries to push deeper into Zaporizhzhia. And Ukraine hasn't finished yet. On February the 18th, UA Wire reported that Ukrainian forces had pushed Russia's troops back another 4.5 kilometers, or 2.8 miles, in 3 sectors near Huliopole. That push added to advances that Ukraine has already made across a 20-kilometer or 12.4-mile stretch of the front line in the Oleksandrivka-Huliopole axis, the outlet says. With this latest push, Ukraine has made advances near the settlements of Tarnova, Verbova, and Vishneva. The spokesperson for Ukraine's Defense Forces of the South, Vladislav Voloshin, has also reported that reconnaissance operations are underway to enable Ukraine's assault forces to find and eliminate more Russian infiltrators, thus solidifying Ukraine's control over the territory it has liberated. And all of this was made possible by Ukraine's Pokrovsk sacrifice. Ukraine gave a little to gain a lot. But remember, we told you that Ukraine had something of a helping hand in all of this, and that helping hand came from Elon Musk and SpaceX. Now, in early February, SpaceX made the long-awaited decision to cut off Russia's access to Starlink by blacklisting the illicit terminals that Russia had been using for long-range drone strikes and communication on the front. That single decision caused chaos in Russia's military, BBC News Russian reported on February the 10th. Having access to Starlink has allowed forces on both sides to quickly exchange information, thus enabling them to coordinate their operations. Now, Russia doesn't have Starlink. Ukraine still does. Its terminals have been added to a whitelist to ensure that they still work, while Russia flounders without access to one of the key things that were keeping its troops alive on the battlefield. Russia has been trying to create backup communications to overcome this massive loss, but none is as effective as Starlink. So what we've seen in Ukraine's southeast is Ukrainian forces timing their push with the Russian loss of Starlink. And when taken into that context, the sacrifice of Pokrovsk makes even more sense. Ukraine bluffed Russia into thinking that it was making a massive battlefield gain so that it could swoop in through Zaporizhzhia to snatch back territory from Russian infiltrators who had been left alone and vulnerable due to their Starlink terminals being severed. And to make matters even worse for Russia, Starlink isn't coming back. Putin's forces may now hold Pokrovsk, but for the push into Donetsk that comes off the back of that, they'll be without the convenient communication system that has allowed them to coordinate their offensive so well up to this point. And so well might be an overstatement. Russia has lost over 1.25 million of its soldiers so far in the war, according to Ukraine's Ministry of Finance. Now that those forces have lost access to Starlink, the future for Russia seems to be a whole lot more death and even slower gains on the battlefield. Now that you know about the vital sacrifice that Ukraine has made and the effect that it has had on Russia's southern army, we need to answer the key question that we've touched on several times already. Why? Well, peace talks have something to do with it, so stick with us to find out why. But the first and most important reason that Ukraine made the Pokrovsk sacrifice is that it needed to close the gap on Zaporizhzhia. We've already told you that Russia had a fairly open path to Zaporizhzhia city, but you also need to know why that matters. So Zaporizhzhia is one of the key energy hubs in Ukraine. In addition to being home to the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which is already under Russia's control, the region contains the Dnieper hydroelectric station and the Botievo wind farm, with these three facilities combining to provide 25% of all of Ukraine's electricity. Allowing Russia to run roughshod over Zaporizhzhia would essentially mean giving Putin free rein to do whatever he wants with a quarter of the country's entire supply. Novaya Gazeta adds that Russia has been piling the pressure on Zaporizhzhia through the battlefield gains it had made during the winter, much of which Ukraine has reversed with its brilliant counteroffensive. Zaporizhzhia city itself had been edging closer to being in range of Russia's artillery, which would have allowed Putin's forces to brutalize the city as they have so many others in Ukraine. Voloshin adds that Russia had been transferring airborne units from places like Kherson and Dnipro to regions around Zaporizhzhia, likely in preparation for a concerted assault on the city at some point in the spring. Zaporizhzhia needs to be protected for these reasons. And with Ukraine having a good idea of what's coming later in 2026, the sacrifice of Pokrovsk to counter in the southeast is a brilliant position. Now that Ukraine controls so much territory that Russia took just a couple of months ago, it's able to fortify ahead of the renewed Russian path. Ukraine will create defenses like those that we saw in Pokrovsk, which means that Russia will have to sacrifice soldiers and equipment just to regain what it has just lost in advance of any sort of push towards Zaporizhzhia city itself. What we're essentially seeing is Ukraine setting up to implement its attrition-based defense against Russia once again. And even if Russia is able to break through those defenses, a great loss to itself, Zaporizhzhia city isn't going to be an easy capture. As the Armed Forces of Ukraine Colonel Roman Zvitan explains to Novaya Gazeta, the Russian offensive hasn't let up for a minute since the autumn of 2023, but there's no question of them capturing Zaporizhzhia yet. It's a very large city, which had a population of over 700,000 people before the invasion in February 2022. There may still be up to 500,000 people living there. Zvitan believes that 2026 won't be the year that Russia takes Zaporizhzhia city, and that's the entire point of what Ukraine is doing. The more time that it can buy through counteroffensives, the better the defenses it can create, and the more damage that it can do to Russia's attacking forces in the future. Still, the question has to be asked, what about Donetsk? Well, there are two angles to take with the sacrifice of Pokrovsk beyond what we've seen in Ukraine's southeast. The first of those angles is that Pokrovsk had already served its purpose for Ukraine. The city was a logistical hub, sure, though its importance in that area had diminished substantially by 2025. Since Russia launched its summer offensive in 2025, Pokrovsk and the regions around it have been used more as a kill zone by Ukraine, again with the intention of tearing through Russia's Donetsk forces so they're too exhausted to do what Putin needs them to do next. And Pokrovsk has been very effective as an attritional force that ripped through Russia. As recently as February, the head of communications for the 7th Rapid Response Corps of Ukraine's air assault forces, Colonel Volodymyr Polevy, was telling the New Voice of Ukraine that Russia was losing about 6,000 soldiers per month trying to take Pokrovsk. The number was likely higher when taking into account all of the settlements around Pokrovsk that Russia's forces were trying to take. Before that, David Axe wrote in his Trenchard column that Russia had suffered 10,000 casualties trying to take Pokrovsk between January and the beginning of October 2025. The New Voice of Ukraine adds that Russia lost 15,000 soldiers in 6 months, up to February, trying to capture Pokrovsk, all solely within the sector of the 7th Rapid Response Corps zone of defense. Again, there would have been more losses elsewhere. The point here is that Pokrovsk destroyed much of the force that Putin dedicated to taking the city, and it has left the remains of that force utterly shattered for what Putin needs it to do next. Take Kramatorsk and Sloviansk. Now, I mentioned those two cities earlier in the video, and they're set to give Russia a much harder time than Pokrovsk ever did. The reason is that they, along with several others, are part of the Donetsk fortress belt that Ukraine has spent the last couple of years building up. And when we said that Pokrovsk had served its purpose, we also meant that Ukraine holding the city for as long as it did had given it time to amass defenses elsewhere in Donetsk. Medusa calls that fortress belt the deal breaker because Putin is demanding that Ukraine hand it over without a fight. Now, this isn't the showcase of strength that Putin wants it to appear to be. Russia's president knows that his military faces a literal hell on earth as it tries to push from Pokrovsk into the Donetsk fortress belt, and the scale of death seen in Pokrovsk will look like nothing in comparison to what this belt of cities delivers to Russia. A peek inside the fortress belt fortifications provided by United 24 media demonstrates why. It says that the Donetsk region has been turned into a defense network of fortifications that stretches for miles, all of which are layered and many of which are placed on higher ground that gives Ukraine's artillery operators and drone pilots clear views of the Russian forces that will attempt to infiltrate. Barbed wire, mines, anti-tank defenses, and countless drones now occupy the kill zones that Russia will have to navigate to even get close to the fortress belt itself. And after going through that meat grinder, Russia still has to capture the cities that make up the belt itself, several of which are larger than Pokrovsk. It's a task that the Institute for the Study of War says could take Russia up until 2028 to complete. And that adds up to at least 2 more years of constant death in Putin's army. Pokrovsk was a precursor for all of this, and Ukraine's sacrifice of it is essentially an invitation to Putin's forces to try their luck in a vast kill zone that makes Pokrovsk look like a picnic. And to Zaporizhzhia, Ukraine is now in a position to create similar layered defenses that have the potential to make 2026 the most catastrophic year for the Russian army that we've seen since Putin launched his invasion. Finally, there are the peace talks we mentioned a few minutes ago. Ukraine's sacrifice of Pokrovsk was clever because all it meant was that Russia gained something that it already claimed to have, and that's not exactly leverage for Putin. He's not going to go into peace talks and admit that he lied when he said that Pokrovsk fell in December. And as for Ukraine, it now has almost 80 square miles of liberated territory in the southeast to crow about, and that is leverage. As Russia pushes for Ukraine to cede territory, Ukraine can counter by saying that Russia can't even hold onto the territory that it has. Bear in mind that Ukraine's most recent gains occurred as envoys from Russia and Ukraine were set to meet to discuss peace terms. Why should Ukraine cede? Death awaits its forces elsewhere in Donetsk, and the same will soon be true of Zaporizhzhia now that Ukraine's counterattack has bought it time and territory to set up fortifications. Russia's southern army is going to be broken by what Ukraine has just done, and its Donetsk forces will be exhausted. With its brilliant gamble, Ukraine may just have set itself on the path for total victory against Russia in 2026. And as all of this has been happening, Ukraine has been transforming its drones into ever more efficient death-dealing machines. Ukraine has a 24/7 McDonald's operation in place with its drones, and they're ruining Russia's forces already. Find out more in our video, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more analysis of what's really going on in the Ukraine war.